Ew. Gross. So we've got super edgelord styling. Wait, what? This left side's literally useless. Okay. But why? That's gonna be, I guess, to... Wait. What? That's weird too. Why would you do that? We can't have nice things. During the process of working on this Lenovo Legion review, we noticed that Lenovo was having a bit of an existential crisis. This is a $1,050 system with a 10700 and a GTX 1660 Super. There's another one on Lenovo's website right now that is $1,500, and it has an i5-10400F and an RX 5500 and a power supply that is about 200 watts lower than the one in this. So you have to be careful when you're buying a Lenovo system, basically, because they don't seem to really talk to each other about what the product should cost or what they are. Either way, we're reviewing this one. This is the Legion T5i, or a variant thereof, and it's fairly high end as far as components go. It's one of the highest end that we've tested thus far. We have some $2,000 ones coming up next, and it's going to be competing most directly versus the ABS Challenger that got our, not only It's Better Than Dell award, but our Relatively Impressed award. Before that, this video is brought to you by Crucial and its Crucial X6 portable SSD. We use these external SSDs all over the office for rapidly transferring games and files between systems. The X6 comes in 500 gigabytes, 1 terabyte, 2 terabyte, and 4 terabyte capacities with USB-A or USB Type-C for the cable. For a high-speed and high-capacity external drive from Crucial, click the link in the description below. So a couple things about this one immediately. First of all, there are two versions of this. Don't let it fool you. This is a solid front panel. It is not mesh. There is an AMD version that has a mesh front panel and a mesh top, actually, but this is an Intel system, and we need to get some AMD ones. Actually, I think we just got an AMD system in the $2,000 price bracket, so you'll see those soon. But for now, we're working through another Intel system review. As stated, it's a 10700. It's got a 1 terabyte, 7200 RPM hard drive. It has an PCIe SSD as well. That's 256 gigabytes. 1660 Super. That's the same as a lot of the other sort of higher end systems that we've looked at recently. And then it has an actual tower cooler in it. So as far as cooling goes, this is the first one that, well, ABS kind of did, but first one that has a sort of real cooler inside of it. We have a whole series on these pre-builts now. We have looked at a lot of them. So we looked at the Dell G5 5000. That was $900. It's terrible, shouldn't exist, and Dell agrees because they used mostly e-waste to build it. There was also a CyberPower system that was really close to being good out of the box, except it thermal throttled very easily because of the choices made in both the case cooling configuration and the CPU cooler. So that was very unfortunate because it was this close to being something we could recommend. The CyberPower one, we basically said at about, say, $1,000 was something you could buy and then work with if you know what you're doing. But if you're looking for something you can recommend for a friend or family and you don't want to be their personal IT for it, then it wasn't really a good choice. The iWiPower system, as a quick recap, was impressive, mostly to the extent that it was destroyed in the process of getting it because paying $600 and something for a computer doesn't warrant including packing materials. We're still not really sure why it was shipped that way. But that one was in pieces when we got it. We had to fix it. And then the ABS Challenger, the one that we looked at, so the AL521i or something like that, ALI521, we worked really hard to try and find something that would do well because we needed a pick-me-up after all the negatives we had seen from the pre-builts recently. And it did relatively well overall. In fact, it was the only one so far that we've been able to say we were somewhat impressed with, relatively impressed, and able to mostly recommend, other than the support. Newegg support is garbage tier. But beyond that, the hardware was pretty well done. And as we ramp into this, a really quick thank you to everybody in our audience who has helped us with buying these. We buy them out of pocket to look at them, and it's gotten expensive. But thank you for buying things like our wireframe mouse mats on store.gamersnexus.net. You're making these reviews a lot easier, and you get something high quality and cool in return. These are in stock and shipping now. We just got a huge shipment in. So if you want to grab one, head over to store.gamersnexus.net and pick it up. But otherwise, let's continue talking about this thing. We bought this at the same time we bought the ABS one, also hoping it would be good. We have been let down tremendously, and our days have been ruined. But we'll be looking at this in a teardown, be going over some of the performance notes, thermals, all that stuff as usual, and talking about why this one is more similar to the CyberPower one, where it was really close to making sense, and they just let it slip through their fingers at the end. Okay, so time to take apart the Lenovo Legion 5i. This thing is a lot of plastic. It's not too large, but it does have a spoiler. Makes the down forces are better. And otherwise, we have a plastic side panel, not steel, which is standard. The plastic side panel houses an acrylic window, not tempered glass. That's okay, really not a big deal. The bottom, I've noticed, also has no ventilation here, which means the power supply will have to take air in from the inside of the case. At least that's what we hope they're doing, because otherwise it's going to suffocate. So power supply intake, actually, yes, in fact, is internal. The front of the case, so that's not mesh. There's a little bit of an intake down here, a little bit in the sides, not much, but at least there's not too much plastic. There's no grill there. Actually, it looks like wait, what? This left side's literally useless. I'm looking into the side and all I can see is plastic. I can't see fans. So that left side actually does nothing. And the right side, there is a little bit. So all of your intake for this case, a little bit comes in down here in this like maybe 1.5 inch depth area that lines up with the bottom fan. The rest of it's going to come in the slight ventilation on the right side. Not a lot of intake, but all right, let's open this thing up. The AMD one appears to have a mesh front, but that's not the one that Lenovo was promoting on Twitter when we bought this from them. Okay, so we have what looks like a customized motherboard. I can see VRM heatsink and M.2 heatsink that have Lenovo's branding on them, so this has been customized to some extent. The cooler is at least somewhat real. This is a tower cooler. It's relatively dense fin stack. We'll take a look at the fan in a minute. So that is a far more real cooler than we saw with CyberPower with Dell, where you're looking at like a Thermaltake or a Cooler Master modified Intel stock cooler, which by the way is made by Cooler Master also. So this is a lot better looking. We've already done thermals for this. We'll take this off as a result because the testing's already done at this point. So we'll be able to see how well it's secured. Feels actually fairly well installed. It's not wiggling around, which is an indication of bad pressure normally. So good start there. Unfortunately, there's one stick of RAM, which at $1,050 is unacceptable when you consider the ABS system we just reviewed. And I'll need to check the motherboard if it matters which DIMM slot they're using. Most boards, it's 2 and 4 are the ideal positioning, but this is a customized board, so who knows? We'll look. The chipset, for some reason, has no chipset cover even, not even just a heatsink. Doesn't really need the heatsink necessarily, but no cover is a little strange. Exposed silicon for a chipset, just not really something that feels great, especially for $1,050. So that's kind of strange. Cable management, if we look at all this, so it's not super managed. There's not a lot of space on the backside for cables to run. In fact, you can see this 24 pin wouldn't really be able to fit back there. So they've got it run behind this pop out like scaffolding instead. And we have, it looks like the HD audio with the world's thickest cable for some reason routed under a slight cable management pathway. This is kind of a mess compared to the other pre-builts we've looked at in terms of cable management, but it does have a better tower cooler. So I guess the takeaway is we can't have nice things. Only some of the things can be nice, but never all of them. That would be bad. Let's get the front off. Oh, can't do that. So that's an LED. That's going to be for this thing with the diffuser on it. That's kind of annoying and unfortunate. This should be secured to the front of the chassis. It would actually not have been that big of a deal to do. They would have needed to just screw it in there instead of screw it in here. It's getting mounted somewhere anyway. This, they were able to do it with plastic molding instead of additional manual assembly work. The end result is, though, taking the front panel off, we're now tethered when there's actually no point to be, because all of the I/O up here is actually mounted to the chassis as it should be. So that's good, but then they ruin it all by putting the LED on the front panel. So kind of unfortunate loss there. That's weird too. Why would you do that? I'm so confused. So how do I just let that hang there, I guess. Look at the front. For some reason the bottom of the front panel, which is oriented up here right now, has wider spacing holes, and this one has tighter spacing holes. No real difference here in terms of dust. Not a huge difference in terms of airflow. Like, they're still both fairly open. Just confusing, a little bit odd. Does not really affect the quality of the computer, though. Just bizarre. So we are going to be doing this work on our mod mat, actually on top of a mouse mat also. You can go to store.gamersnexus.net if you'd like to grab one of our PC building work surfaces on the table or one of our mouse mats. They're in stock and shipping now. The mod mats, depending on which one you get, are on back order or shipping. Oh, we give them some credit there. The drive cage at the back, down there. So the SATA connector has actually been pre-wired on the other side of this drive cage. So if you added a drive, you would just drop it in and socket it. So that's kind of convenient. Okay. But why? Why would you use a screw when you could just use a screw and a large steel plate? So there's some foam in the back of the PCIe socket. You can see it right down there. That's going to be, I guess, to... Wait. What? Why? Anyway, there's foam down there. Oh, concerned about why that needs to be there. All right, I'm going to start disconnecting cables. This is, it's a little bit of a mess compared to what we've been looking at. CeraPower does get credit for all their very many numerous and varied faults. CeraPower does a pretty good job with cable management. Let's look at this RAM. So this is Samsung 8GB single stick PC4 2933, and we've got 8 memory packages on there. I mean, we'll talk about the timings and stuff in the benchmark section. Hey, pretty good thermal paste coverage. There's a copper cold plate, and we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Looks like 6 mil heat pipes running through it. The oddity is that the fan is screwed in to the fins. Actually, the mounting mechanism. So the fan is actually screwed into the mounting mechanism, which is like, what are you doing? But I guess because the fin stack doesn't come as low as the screw, they didn't really have anywhere to hook it into unless they made a weirdly shaped special clip that would hook in up here, and then it would have to hook into the back because they've got the sidewall closed off. So someone ended up saying, you know what would be easiest? If we run 4 screws into it, customize the top to have some threads, customize the mounting kit to have some threads, and solve it that way. I mean, whatever, at least it's a tower with a fan on it. That's a real 120 mil fan. There is an upside. So it's not the worst I've seen. Put that award on the screen. Now the motherboard is a little bit odd. So you could put this in another case. That's a big positive. Better than Dell. Breaking out that award kind of early this time. Let's just take this off and look at the actual VRM. It's contacting most of the components. Just a little weird. This is like so custom. It's really strange. And then for the power, some reason we have an EPS 12 volt 8 pin and then a 4 pin next to it. All right, so there's a massive M.2 heatsink on this thing. Doesn't. Again, it's just kind of like weird places to spend money when the chipset's got nothing on it. I guess that's what I'm getting at here. This is the 1660 Super. This is not a partner model design, but you can see it's a very similar cooler to Dell's. This cooler design, the flower style, they're often called, is just an aluminum heatsink. It's very similar to what you find on an Intel stock cooler heatsink. No contact to the memory, and unlike when it's MSI, this is actually the OEM's fault. So that Lenovo is making the spec here for this card, so Lenovo's the one deciding not to connect the heatsink to the memory. It's going to be within spec. That's fine, but it's just, it's. Okay, I'm actually even more annoyed now. This memory module right here, why does that one have a thermal pad? This module right here has the world's saddest, loneliest thermal pad. That's not even the... This will be the hottest spot on the board. It's jammed up against the socket. Normally that's the hottest, but there's no thermal pad for those two. No thermal pad for these three. But that one right there gets one. Okay. I don't know. I'm tired of complaining about thermal pads. I wish they'd just do it right. So last thing we'll look at before we move on to the benchmarks that were run before disassembly here is an FSP power supply. So that's a real company. And it's 80 plus gold. Does not necessarily mean anything, but typically is associated with better quality. We can do 650 watts on 12 volts. It's 3 12-volt rails. The max you can do on any one rail is going to be 33 amps. Okay, so we're done with the teardown. Let's move on to some testing. In a quick look at thermals, we discovered the limitations of the front panel. We ran this testing with things left auto-controlled because that's how someone would use the system, where we normally would have more manual controls in place for testing comparisons. In this instance, though, it doesn't really matter. We see what we need to see, which is that the system runs not only cooler with the front panel obstruction removed, but also quieter. This Lenovo system dropped from 2096 RPM average to 1550 RPM average, a massive reduction across the fans and a notable drop in noise, while also dropping about 5 degrees on average. Lenovo's Legion front panel should go full mesh. It would be better for dust control too. The current panel has few gaps, but each one of them is large and without a dust filter. With a mesh panel, however, at least you get some natural dust filtration and even the option of adding a separate filter while maintaining better performance still. Lenovo does have this for AMD already, so they might as well do it here. Thermals were fine overall. We didn't see anything throttling or majorly concerning like we did with the CyberPower system. It could be better without that panel, and more importantly, it could be quieter with a more open panel for ventilation. But at least we're not throttling, so it's a decent start. Let's move on to gaming performance. As always with pre-built testing, their performance is largely determined by CPU and GPU choices made by the OEM or the SI. That means that their allocation of funds and their balancing of components matters the most. These companies don't make the CPU or the GPU, so there's very little they can screw up here, and when they do screw it up, it's normally pretty obvious. Starting with Cyberpunk 2077, the Lenovo system shows both its strength and its weakness all in one go. The weakness is the RAM, where we're unable to exceed the ABS Challenger's lower end 10400F thanks to its superior memory configuration, despite this one having a higher end setup. The strength is the i7-10700, which is the best CPU on this chart currently. Tying the ABS Challenger isn't actually a good thing. Even ignoring the proximity and price, all it does is highlight the point that the Lenovo system hasn't configured its platform in a balanced way, and so it's wasting some of its potential. In Rainbow Six Siege at 1080p, the Lenovo system pulls ahead very slightly in average FPS, though not in a way which matters or is noticeable, despite being technically outside of error. And it hits 202 FPS average versus 199 on the next highest devices. Unfortunately, because of the memory configuration, Lenovo's lows are a much lower 80 FPS 0.1% and 122 FPS 1%, while the ABS system produces frames at more consistent intervals with its 159 and 151 FPS 1% and 0.1%. Only 2 games in, we're starting to see a trend of wasted potential on this higher-end hardware for Lenovo. Showing a frame time plot will help illustrate this problem. As always, lower is better, but consistency is best. Frame-to-frame intervals are shown on the left axis in milliseconds, showing each frame as 1 point on the plot. This means that we're looking at an empirical representation of the gaming experience frame-to-frame. The ABS Challenger plotted nearly perfectly consistently. We're looking for excursions from surrounding frames of less than 8 to 12 milliseconds, ideally, and more than that starts to become potentially noticeable, although it does depend on what game you're playing. The CyberPower system we plotted last time had several spikes from baseline, ultimately dragging down its average to lows. With the Lenovo T5i, we see one spike from about 5 milliseconds to 21 milliseconds, which is a relatively large jump in this game, and several spikes towards 10 milliseconds. 10 milliseconds really isn't a bad amount of time to make a frame. But the problem is that Lenovo is throwing away the potential that it has, especially for what's relatively easily achieved in consistency by just having a better RAM configuration. Better RAM would have done it and would have been money better spent than on some of the other plastic appendages and LED embellishments that are in the case. We see the same thing at 1440p. The ABS Challenger, despite having a CPU with 2 fewer cores, only ties on averages while running behind in lows. The average limitation this time is more imposed by the GPU than anything else, given 1440p, but the lows could improve with better RAM. Hitman 3, as we tested, is brutal on the CPU, but also on the memory. The Challenger, again, ends up technically ahead of the Legion, which has 0.1% lows, more comparable to the $900 junk box from Dell. The extra $50 isn't helping here, nor are the extra 2 cores for the Lenovo Legion build. Red Dead Redemption 2 has the Lenovo Legion T5 at 62 FPS average, once again embarrassing itself in the face of ABS Challenger's weaker CPU outperforming it. This is tested mostly as a GPU benchmark in our configuration, which means anything with a 1660 Super would be roughly equal with all other parts equal. Except they're not, clearly, and some parts are more equal than others. This next chart shows the idle and maximum load noise levels of each system. We also measured the time to ramp, which will be in the next chart. The Lenovo system ended up tied with the Dell G5 for quietest when idle, and it was 1 dBA quieter than the ABS Challenger when under full load. This allowed iBuyPower to keep its rank of loudest under load pre-built. There's nothing alarming here with the Legion. It did fine acoustically, and we don't have complaints with this performance. Its idle behavior is better than the others here. This chart shows the time required to hit that maximum noise level. They're all tested under the same workload, so we can count the time in seconds to hit the maximum RPM under load. In most instances, a longer time to ramp is better, as it means the variable or the transient workloads will be less likely to trigger sudden, loud blasts from fans that will die back just as fast. Frequent change in noise is normally more noticeable to people than the noise level overall. The CyberPower system is a little bit touchy at 8 seconds to max noise. It should probably see someone about that. The Lenovo T5 was next at 56 seconds to its steady state noise level. The Dell G5 took the longest to ramp, with the Challenger and the Slate in between. Power consumption in Blender shows that we're way overkill on the power supply, using just 221 watts under a heavy Blender workload during tau boosting, or 102 with tau expired. That's not necessarily a bad thing, to be overkill that is, unless the power supply could have been cut down in favor for better RAM to meet the same bill of materials cost. In gaming workloads, the system ends up pulling about the same as the ABS Challenger or the CyberPower pre-built, so it's not like it's notably inefficient. It's just not reaching full potential for gaming overall. The averages in FPS were close, and the power is close, so this mostly makes sense, just about smoothing those numbers over now. Finally, it's time to talk about some of the way Lenovo set up the system, and that includes presence of bloatware, instructions, and BIOS configuration. First, unfortunately, the system does come pre-installed with McAfee software. McAfee antivirus is one of the contributing factors to some of the earlier low frame time consistency that we saw, as seen in the Dell system too. Removing this particular bloatware still leaves behind Windows services that hog resources, especially when certain applications launch, like Hitman 3. This is a major negative for Lenovo, and you'd unfortunately be better off blowing away the OS and reinstalling it with your own. At least then you'd know what's on there. Connecting to the internet was also a mistake, apparently. We were instantly hit with a ton of pop-ups about McAfee, about optimizing the internet, which, by the way, isn't a thing, so don't fall for it, and also more about registering Lenovo products. This is an absolutely horrible experience for first boot, and Lenovo, if your team is watching, shouting, "Write that down," and making a note to only do it on second boot instead, that's still bad. This shouldn't be happening. Unfortunately, it's very common with OEM products. SIs normally do a better job of this particular aspect. At these prices, though, the system really, it should just be clean. This stuff doesn't help anybody. Nobody benefits from this stuff. Lenovo has its own Vantage software installed. Apparently, it takes its name from literally every giant mega corporation ever with Vantage, but it can be used to configure RGB LEDs. There's no RGB LED functionality on first boot. We're not sure why. It's definitely possible. You don't need software to do that. For BIOS, the board, despite being custom, does have more options than Dell. For instance, we actually have control over the fan speeds and the fan profiles via BIOS, so this is a good thing. Memory options are, however, sorely limited, and NVMe options were also not present, despite having an NVMe drive. Memory was configured out of box to 2933 MHz, which is the spec for a 10700 non-K CPU. Timings were expectedly loose, unfortunately, but that's more a consequence of the stick that was used. We didn't find any missing drivers in Device Manager. This is sadly a feat of accomplishment for some of these OEMs. A couple of other things too. The plastic bag encircling the system had its own tamper seal on it, oddly, so that's sort of a new level of distrust of the consumer. There wasn't even a warranty or a tamper seal on the computer itself or on the panels, but there was one on the plastic bag. Oddly, Lenovo doesn't include any setup instructions at all. at least not with ours. This is something that CyberPower does really well, and it's something that others would do well to follow. There's not a physical manual or even a QR code for a first-time setup for a new user. Some of the worst peripherals in the world, however, are included, so that makes up for the lack of instructions. They're not the same level as the rest of the system, and it's wasteful to include them. It brings down the perceived value of this Lenovo box. Most of these will break in short order anyway, so it's not like Lenovo is doing anyone any favors. We're not asking Lenovo to include better stuff for free. We'd literally rather them remove it and charge us the same and replace it with nothing than to offload their trash on us and the landfills after everyone's done breaking these or throwing them away. The system seems unlikely to have any major assembly mistakes. In that sense, like Dell, it's all orchestrated and probably has reasonable QC checks in place. Most of our problems with this were not related to assembly because that aspect, it was done well. Everything was plugged in, it was where it was supposed to be, and that's asking a lot, again, for the SIs. So closing this one out, we were overall disappointed with it, but not surprised, which is sort of sad to say. We expected better. This one is, so there's many variants of the Lenovo Legion systems. Keep that, just like all of these. All of these brands have systems that will do poorly and systems that will do maybe well. Doing well is a lot harder than doing poorly. That's pretty easy to achieve most of the time. Certainly ABS has some systems that we probably wouldn't recommend based on the on-paper specs alone. This one we genuinely did try to buy a configuration that made sense. The only thing we were expecting when we ordered it was that we'd hate the case, and we do. But we thought the rest of it would be overall good. Now the biggest problem is, unfortunately, Lenovo is throwing away a lot of its potential lead. At $50 more, you do get some better hardware than the ABS box. Case is not better, but the power supply is good. The CPU is better, it's 10700 versus 10400, 10400F. And the GPU is the same, but the memory, unfortunately, is somewhere where, for whatever reason, Lenovo said, this we can cheap out on. We don't need to spend money here. No one will notice. Let's put some high RPM RGB fans in there instead, install McAfee on it, and let them figure it out. So unfortunately, it fell short because of that. You look at the frame time consistency, it's just not as good. Memory capacity is not as good. At $1,050, it is utterly obscene that this has a single 8 GB stick with the specs that the stick has. That's insane. Like it doesn't, there's plenty of room in cost to put another stick in there. And if Lenovo needs to pinch pennies, they can pull something else out. You don't need a 650 watt power supply in here to run a 220 watt load. But it's almost there. Maybe the AMD one would do better. We might look at it. There's so many pre-built companies out there though, we're kind of just doing one at a time from each company. Then we might circle back and get some of the others and look at those in the future. But we want to kind of spot check everybody first so that we know what to expect from each company. Biggest misstep was in the RAM configuration, wastes the potential of the 10700 immensely. The value goes down versus the ABS system. So compared to the ABS system, this is worse, and we're left relatively unimpressed. Unfortunately, this is still better than some of the other ones we've looked at. It's better than the Dell box, even at the price difference. And it's overall better than the CyberPower one, because it doesn't thermal throttle out of the box, which is an instant failing grade in most instances for us. So, yeah, I don't know. It's like, if you have no other options, this isn't the worst thing you could buy, but it feels pretty bad to buy it. So we're gonna keep looking for other stuff. ABS still is our #1 out of this round, but as stated, we have two $2,000 systems coming through the pipeline now. Patrick's been working on them, and we'll try and get some more in the $1,000 range. Really want to get some AMD ones in this price range, but the first one we're gonna be looking at is about $2,000. So we'll bring it back to $1,000, $1,050, see if we can find something else other than ABS to recommend, because obviously that's just one system, and there's definitely more out there that don't suck. They're really hard to find. And if you're not in the US, it's hard to get ABS as well. So that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more as always. If you want to help out with this type of content, you can go to store.gamersnexus.net and grab one of our wireframe mouse mats. They are in stock and shipping now. Please, if you have an idea for what to look at next, post it in the comments below. And we actually bought this one and the ABS box based on recommendations, so we'll read through them and see what you all have to say. Subscribe for more. We'll see you all next time.